February 1st, 1943, above the Tunisian desert at 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Harry C. Nusel noted the way his pencil scratched against the navigation chart. He plotted their return route from Tunis. The numbers blurred slightly due to the condensation on his oxygen mask. In just 17 minutes, they would be past the range of German fighters. 17 minutes until they reached relative safety. The intercom crackled as the tail gunner warned about fighters at 12 o'clock high, approaching quickly. Nusel hardly had time to react. Then he heard it. A sound that would stay with him forever. Not an explosion, not the familiar clatter of machine gun fire. Instead, he would describe it later in a letter home as a clearly audible swoosh, followed by a jarring impact and a loud whump through the plexiglass nose cone of their Boeing B-17. All-American 3. He watched in shock as parts of a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 slid past their wing and chunks of its fuselage scattered nearby. The canopy, with its iron cross, spiraled down toward the desert 5 miles below. The fighter didn't explode. It wasn't shot down in the usual way. It collided with their bomber. And somehow, against all odds, they were still airborne. What Lieutenant Harry C. Nusel didn't realize, what none of the 10 crew members could understand in that instant, was that they had just become part of one of the most documented and studied events in aviation history. Their B-17 was flying with its tail section nearly severed, held together only by a few metal spars and thin strips of aluminum skin. A photograph captured of their aircraft in the next hour would become an iconic image of World War II. Engineers and pilots would study it for decades. The math behind their survival challenged all known principles of aerodynamics. Everything suggested they should have been dead, spiraling into pieces over the Sahara. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. gripped the control yoke, determined like a former Duke University halfback who had never lost a game in his illustrious 1938 season. He somehow kept 65,000 pounds of damaged aluminum flying. This moment would spark one of the most improbable survival stories in aerial warfare. It was a showcase of American engineering and human resolve that would force the German Luftwaffe to completely rethink their views on the B-17 Flying Fortress. The engines roared to life in the early morning hours at Biskra Airfield in Algeria. The vibrations from the right cyclone radials shook the desert sand that settled across the base. February 1st arrived with remarkable clarity. There were no sandstorms, little wind, and visibility was perfect for bombing. During the 400 hours briefing, First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson noted the conditions as ideal. Sinani Bragg Jr. ran his hands over All-American 3 during his pre-flight check. At 25 years old, Bragg exuded the quiet confidence of someone who had excelled in many fields. Back home in Savannah, newspapers still covered his achievements with Duke's 1938 Iron Dukes. The team went undefeated and was unscored upon during the regular season. That mental toughness and refusal to accept defeat had been invaluable since he traded his football cleats for flight boots. Bragg had flown the Boeing B-17 F-5BO with serial number 4124406 since August 24, 1942. He was familiar with every rivet, quirk, and sound the aircraft made. Built at Boeing's Seattle plant, she crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, the large-scale reinforcement for the European theater. The ground crew painted her name in large letters on the nose, All-American 3, the third aircraft to carry that hopeful name after previous versions were lost in combat. "She's running smooth as silk," reported Lieutenant Technical Sergeant Joe C. James from the Flight Engineers panel. James, who would also handle the top turret once they entered enemy territory, had the mechanical intuition that distinguished great engineers. If James said the aircraft was ready, it was ready. The crew that gathered that morning embodied the unique democracy of the American war effort. They came from diverse backgrounds, united by their training and purpose. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr., hailed from a banking family in Connecticut. Navigator Harry C. Nusel left his engineering studies at the University of Minnesota to join the Army Air Forces. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was one of the most experienced men on board, having earned his wings before Pearl Harbor at just 23 years old. The enlisted crew brought their own skills, including radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway, who was a master at his craft. Temperamental liaison radios connected the bomber formations. Waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Condor, who was a last-minute replacement from the 341st Squadron, checked their .50 caliber Brownings repeatedly. Staff Sergeant Sam T. Seropoulos, who would soon gain the nickname Lonesome Sam for reasons that would soon be chillingly clear, settled into his isolated position. He did so with the calm acceptance of a man aware that he was the bomber's most vulnerable defender. The 97th Bombardment Group was the first American heavy bomber unit to engage in combat in Europe. They flew their first mission from England on August 17, 1942. Since then, they had moved to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, aiding the ground campaign to oust Axis forces from the continent. The group had already suffered significant losses. They had lost aircraft and crews to enemy fighters, flak, and the unforgiving math of strategic bombing. Today's target was vital in the German supply chain: the port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte. Each ton of supplies that arrived at these ports stretched Axis resistance in North Africa. Each successful bombing run brought the Allies one step closer to liberating the continent and paving the way into southern Europe. Over the Mediterranean, the formation assembled with the precision of an aerial performance. 12 B-17s from the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed their defensive box pattern. This three-dimensional structure was designed to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from their .50 caliber machine guns. All-American 3 took its place on the right wing of the lead aircraft, flaming, under the command of Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The absence of a fighter escort loomed over the formation like a shadow. The P-38 Lightnings that were meant to provide protection were grounded due to mechanical issues. The B-17s had to depend on their own guns and the theoretical mutual protection that had yet to be truly tested against determined fighter attacks. At 20,000 feet, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the windows, and the crew's breath froze inside their oxygen masks, necessitating constant removal of ice crystals that could obstruct airflow. The electrically heated flight suits, a marvel of American technology, struggled against the frigid conditions at such altitude. Men returned from missions with frostbite that matched their combat injuries. Target in view, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge announced over the intercom as Tunis came into view through the clouds below. The port was bustling with activity. Ships were unloading supplies, trains waited on sidings, and trucks moved toward the front lines where the Africa Corps was making a final stand against the forces of Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2nd Corps. The bomb run required total precision. For 3 minutes, the aircraft had to fly straight and level. There was no evasive action while Burbridge lined up his Norden bomb sight with the target below. This secret device, carefully guarded by the Americans, was removed from aircraft after every mission. It used a complex system of gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact bomb release point. Flak was coming up, someone reported unnecessarily. Everyone could see the black puffs appearing around them, each puff representing numerous pieces of shrapnel aimed at the plane. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed for anti-tank use, had proven highly effective against bombers. Each shell was designed to explode at a set altitude, creating a deadly zone that bombers had to navigate. "Bombs away," Burbridge called out. All 3 American aircraft surged upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from their bomb bays. Below, the port erupted in smoke and flames. There were direct hits on the warehouses, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, and ships listing at their moorings. It was a successful strike, possibly their best yet. But the celebration was brief. As the formation turned west toward home, enemy fighters appeared. "Bandits at 2 o'clock high, looks like 109s, came the warning from several gunners at once, as 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109 G4 fighters dove down from the sun. The German pilots had learned that the B-17's defensive fire was weakest from the front. The nose guns could not aim low enough to hit fighters approaching from below, and the top turret could not track fast enough for high-speed frontal attacks. The first fighter, piloted by Eloit Julius Memberg of 11JG2, temporarily assigned to Jagdgeschwader 53, opened fire from 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns sparkled as he unloaded rounds into the aircraft. The lead bomber shook violently from the hit, aluminum fragments flying away like confetti. The second fighter, piloted by Feldwebel Erich Paczia of 6JG53, targeted all three American planes. Paczia was inexperienced. With 16 confirmed kills, he had received the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, an honor given to skilled fighter pilots. He knew exactly where to aim. He could target the cockpit to kill the pilots, the engines of the bomber, or the wing roots housing the fuel tanks. But something went wrong. At 300 yards, Paczia initiated his escape maneuver, a half-roll meant to take him beneath the bomber, away from its defensive fire. He had performed this move many times before, but this time, whether due to overconfidence, target fixation, or mechanical failure, he started too late. Or perhaps he never started it because he was already dead. Ralph Burbridge would later remember having him in his sights. Paczia flew straight toward them, and Burbridge saw his face through the windscreen. Then, the top turret opened fire. James had him in sight as well. The fighter jolted as if someone had pulled on a string and began to roll lazily to the right. Technical Sergeant Joe James, operating the twin 50 calibers in the top turret, hit the Bf-109's cockpit directly with a burst of fire. At least one bullet, possibly more, struck Erich Paczia. Whether he died instantly or was simply incapacitated, the outcome was the same. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft, moving at over 350 miles per hour, was suddenly without control. What followed happened in less than 2 seconds but would be studied for many years. The Bf-109, now out of control, crashed into the American 3 just after the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing sliced through the bomber's fuselage as easily as a sword through paper, leaving a diagonal gash from the base of the vertical stabilizer to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Newell's account, written to his brother soon after, offers a vivid description. The fighter struck us with a swoosh and a bang that shook the entire aircraft. I looked back through the companionway and couldn't believe my eyes. There was daylight where there should have been an airplane. The physics of the impact were incomprehensible. The Bf-109's wing, moving at nearly 400 miles per hour, should have split the B-17 in half. By sheer luck, or what many on the crew would later term divine intervention, the fighter's wing narrowly missed the main structural supports on the right side of the fuselage. The tail section, which included Staff Sergeant Sam Saralis, hung on by what investigators later referred to as the bare minimum needed for any control. The German fighter fell apart. Its wing, ripped away by the collision, was still partly lodged in the fuselage of the B-17. The engine and forward fuselage spun away in flames. The tail section, marked by its distinctive yellow nose and black crosses, twirled like a maple seed toward the desert below. Inside that burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Paczia, born on May 7, 1918, in Germany. He would be awarded posthumously on March 1, 1943, never knowing that his death had sparked one of aviation's most incredible survival tales. Meanwhile, the crew of the American B-17 faced their own issues. These problems, according to the laws of physics and aerodynamics, should have been impossible to overcome. Pilot to crew, check in. Is everyone okay? Bragg's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, masking the physical effort required to handle controls that had suddenly become unresponsive. The control cables for the tail surfaces, the elevator, and the rudder had been torn or severely damaged. The aircraft was starting to nosedive into what pilots termed a graveyard spiral. One by one, the crew reported back. Amazingly, no one had been hurt in the collision. But when it was the tail gunner's turn to respond, there was silence on the intercom. Sam Saralis, are you okay back there? Still, there was no answer. The communication line to the tail had been severed. However, through the jagged hole in the fuselage, the waist gunners noticed movement in the tail section. Sam Saralis was alive, trapped in a tail section moving independently from the aircraft, swaying in the airflow like a kite on a string in a hurricane. as one crew member vividly described. The damage was overwhelming. The left horizontal stabilizer was entirely missing, severed by the wing of the Bf-109. The elevator on that side had disappeared with it. The vertical stabilizer, the large upright tail surface, bore a massive gash at its base. The fuselage was opened up like a tin can from the tail gunner's spot to just behind the waist windows. Control cables dangled in the slipstream. Hydraulic fluid dripped from broken lines. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, the navigator on a nearby B-17 plane, got close enough to snap a photograph that would later become famous. It showed the tail section of All-American 3 misaligned at an angle, indicating it was on the brink of structural failure. The diagonal gash in the fuselage was clear, along with the missing stabilizer. Miraculously, the aircraft was still flying level, defying the laws of physics. In a tense moment, someone spoke over the intercom, warning that the back end was about to come off. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked urgently with Bragg to discover control inputs that would keep them in the air. With the usual control surfaces damaged, they needed to think outside the box. The autopilot system connected to the Norden bomb site utilized electrical servos instead of mechanical cables. By activating it partially, they could achieve some stability. They also considered differential engine power. By running the left engines at a higher power than the right, they could lessen the tendency to yaw. However, every input had to be soft and calculated. Too much pressure on any control could cause the tail to simply tear off. Major Coulter's anxious voice crackled over the radio from Flaming Mai, which had suffered damage in the fighter attack. "Can you make it home?" Bragg checked the fuel gauges. No serious leaks were present. The tanks showed enough reserve. All engines were operational, with normal temperatures and pressures. The electrical systems were working fine. The only issue with the aircraft was the loss of a large portion of its structure. Just a minor detail. "We're going to try," Bragg replied. In the almost severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Saris faced a choice that could paralyze most people. He could stay put, hoping the tail would hold until they landed, or he could crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the main body of the aircraft for safety. The tail section was moving on its own, sometimes misaligned by feet with the rest of the plane. Each movement put stress on the few remaining connections. Any sudden motion or strong turbulence could be disastrous. He was riding 5 tons of aluminum toward his fate. Saris made his choice. He gathered his chest parachute and his gear, along with a borrowed jacket from Lieutenant Bragg. Then, he began the most perilous 30 feet he would ever traverse. Inside the fuselage, the scene was chaotic. Daylight poured through tears in the aluminum. The wind howled through the gaps, stirring up loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The floor of the fuselage, not meant to handle weight alone, flexed dangerously beneath him. One wrong move could send him plummeting into 5 miles of empty air. Waist gunner Michael Zook observed Saris with admiration and disbelief. "He crawled through that mess like it was a Sunday stroll," Zook would later recount. He was calm, dragging his gear behind him. Once he reached them, he handed me the lieutenant's jacket and said, "Make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land." What should have taken seconds stretched to 10 minutes, but Sam Saris had made it. All 10 crew members were now gathered in the forward section of the aircraft in case they needed to bail out. The bomber formation faced a tough decision. Standard procedure called for leaving behind damaged aircraft that could not keep up. Those planes risked the entire formation by slowing them down and making them more vulnerable to fighter attacks. However, the crews of the 414th Squadron would not abandon All-American 3. The formation tightened around the wounded bomber, forming a defensive shield with their combined firepower. They accepted greater risks, flying slower and staying longer in enemy airspace. These men had trained together, lived alongside each other at the harsh North African bases, and mourned lost friends. The importance of loyalty overshadowed the arithmetic of survival. "All-American, this is Red Leader," the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're out of fighter range. Keep her steady." The German fighters, seeing the tight formation and perhaps running low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or so they believed. Julius Mimmerberg, Erich Paczya's wingman, would make it through the day, despite suffering serious burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his memoir, Find Burong, he claimed a B-17 kill from this fight. He was partly correct. Flaming May would indeed go down. Major Coulter and 6 crew members were killed, but all American 3 refused to die. As the formation finally crossed into Allied airspace, the other bombers began to break away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All American 3, flying at a slower speed to ease the strain on its damaged structure, would make the journey alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra airfield should have taken an hour. For All American 3, fighting to stay in the air, it would take 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket and bit of turbulence sent shudders through the aircraft, making the crew hold their breath. The tail section moved independently, sometimes lining up with the fuselage, and at other times angling in ways that seemed impossible. Bragg and Ingle found a rhythm, a delicate dance with the struggling aircraft. They applied gentle pressure on the yoke and made incremental adjustments to the throttles. They sensed the aircraft's response through their hands and feet, rather than relying solely on instruments. Flight engineer Joe James kept a close watch on the engines. Number 3 was running a bit hot, likely due to debris damage, but it remained within acceptable limits. Oil pressure was steady across all 4 engines. Fuel consumption actually improved because of their reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, built in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady thunder. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Newell had been continuously calculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways, what pilots referred to as crabbing. This affected both their speed and fuel usage, but his calculations indicated they would make it, though with minimal reserves. 40 minutes. "Skipper, the weather's still clear at base." Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with the Biskra Tower, updating them on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle, including ambulances and fire trucks. Crash crews lined the runway. The base commander had come to the tower to oversee the situation. The crew prepared for landing with precise mechanical movements. Each man checked and rechecked his equipment. They kept their parachutes on. If the tail fell off during landing, they might only have seconds to escape. Waist gunners Zuck and Condard secured loose gear that could become dangerous during a crash. The bombardier Burbridge made sure the bomb site was secured, sticking to the protocol even under pressure. Unbeknownst to the crew of All American 3, their survival was shaking up the German fighter community in North Africa. Pilots who saw the collision were filing reports. Meanwhile, intelligence officers struggled to make sense of what they had witnessed. The Luftwaffe had extensive experience with the B-17 Flying Fortress. They had been battling these bombers since the United States entered the European Air War. They believed they understood the bomber's strengths and weaknesses. German technical analysis had concluded that a B-17 required about 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells to be destroyed. The aircraft's multiple redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and sturdy design made it incredibly tough to bring down. But a B-17 flying with half of its tail missing was beyond their predictions. Initial reports were met with doubt. Surely the pilots must have been mistaken. Maybe the bomber would crash later, out of sight. No aircraft could survive such damage. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Multiple pilots had seen All American 3 flying in formation after the impact. Ground observers tracked it on radar, maintaining altitude and course long after it should have fallen. This incident would be noted in a growing collection of reports that pushed the Luftwaffe to rethink their strategies for attacking American heavy bombers. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces and a key figure in Luftwaffe tactics, would later discuss the psychological effect of American bomber resilience. Witnessing a flying fortress continue to fly with damage that would have destroyed any other aircraft was demoralizing for our young pilots. They would fire their ammunition, land what should have been lethal hits, and watch the Americans fly home. Biskra Tower, this is All American, 5 minutes out. Request a direct approach to runway 27. All American Biskra Tower, you are cleared for an immediate approach to runway 27. Emergency vehicles are on standby. How many injured do you have on board? Bragg and Engel exchanged looks. They should all be dead, yet here they were, 10 men unharmed, at least not from the collision. Tower, all American, we have no wounded. We just need a straight approach. We are experiencing structural damage. That was an understatement. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield emerged from the desert haze. Home, safety, solid ground. It was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. Engel announced the gear was coming down as he moved the lever. The landing gear operated on a separate hydraulic system from the control surfaces. To everyone's relief, they heard and felt the reassuring thunk as the wheels locked into place. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. The gear was down and locked. Flaps? Engel asked. Bragg thought it over. Flaps would slow them down, but also change the airflow over the tail, increasing stress on the damaged structure. No flaps. We will come in hot and use the entire runway. The approach required every bit of skill Bragg had gained from hours of flight training. The aircraft was reluctant to fly straight. It wanted to yaw, roll, and pitch down. Each correction required an opposite action. It was a constant struggle against aerodynamic forces that should have claimed them miles ago. 1 mile out, then half a mile. The runway rushed to meet them, wider and more welcome than any runway had ever seemed. Ground crews lined the taxiways, watching in stunned silence as the impossible aircraft made its approach. Some would later claim they saw daylight through the fuselage from a quarter-mile away. The main wheels touched the sand-swept runway at 110 miles per hour, faster than usual, yet as gently as Bragg could manage. The aircraft settled, and for a moment it appeared the landing would be perfect. Then physics reasserted itself. Without the tail wheel, which had been destroyed in the collision, the tail section dropped to the runway. The aircraft turned into a 65,000-pound sled, grinding down the runway in a shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The noise was indescribable. Metal on concrete created a shriek that could be heard miles away. Bragg and Engel pressed hard on the brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it slowed down. Without the tail wheel and with limited rudder control, any slight change in direction could trigger a ground loop. This would cause the aircraft to violently spin, likely tearing it apart. The aircraft finally came to a stop, resting at an awkward angle. Its tail was on the runway while its nose pointed upward. For a brief moment, everyone stood still. Then, as if prompted, all 10 crew members rushed to exit the aircraft. They gathered on the runway and looked back at their plane in disbelief. The damage was worse than they had feared. The tail section hung at an unusual angle, connected to the fuselage by strips of aluminum that seemed as thin as heavy paper. It was unfathomable how it stayed intact for 90 minutes of flight. "No worries, Doc," Bragg said to the flight surgeon, who hurried over with his medical team. "We're all fine. Not a scratch." The doctor glanced between the crew and the aircraft, his expression suggesting he was witnessing either a miracle or a mass hallucination. What occurred next would become legendary, shared in ready rooms throughout the theater. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 for a closer inspection. They peered through the gash in the fuselage, amazed at the destruction. Their combined weight, around 500 pounds, was the final tipping point. With a grinding and tearing sound, the overstressed metal finally gave way. The tail section completely detached from the fuselage and fell onto the runway. The 3 airmen scrambled away, pale and shaken, realizing just how close to danger the aircrew had been for the past 90 minutes. Master Sergeant Hank Highland, the crew chief for All-American 3, walked carefully around the wreckage, taking notes on a clipboard. He needed to decide whether the aircraft could be repaired or should be deemed a total loss. This question seemed straightforward. No aircraft this damaged could ever fly again. But it was 1943, and America was producing B-17 bombers at an astonishing rate, remarkable to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach, workers finished a new flying fortress every few hours. The production lines operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, manned by those too old or too young for military service. Service and the contributions of women who had never set foot in a factory before Pearl Harbor were crucial. Hyland gazed at the serial number on the tail, 412446. This aircraft had already endured more than most machines should. Perhaps it still had one last miracle in store. Conventional wisdom declared All-American 3 to be finished. The damage seemed too severe, the structural integrity too fragile. In any other Air Force, it would have been stripped for parts and scrapped. However, the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 held a different view. If it could be repaired, it would be repaired. Master Sergeant Hyland and the crew from the 50th Air Service Squadron dedicated 6 weeks to what could only be described as major surgery. They secured a tail section from another B-17 that had been damaged in a landing accident. Utilizing methods more typical of a shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they attached the salvaged tail to All-American 3. The process was detailed and exhausting. Every rivet had to be flawless. Each control cable needed proper tension. Every electrical connection required thorough testing. The men labored in scorching desert heat, reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Then came the freezing temperatures of desert nights. They worked hard because every repaired aircraft meant an additional bomber to strike the enemy, bringing them closer to ending the war. The repair was rough compared to Boeing factory standards. The aircraft would never be as it was before. It would be slower, less agile, and susceptible to vibrations that hadn't existed earlier. But on May 10, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, taking another crew on a mission to Sicily. The ground crews observed her takeoff with a blend of pride and worry. They had resurrected her, but would she hold up? She did. All-American 3 would continue flying missions, though assigned to less demanding tasks like transport flights, training missions, and low-risk milk runs. She had earned an easier life. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her wartime journey at last complete. Research into the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 uncovers the story of a young man whose life intertwined with history in a profoundly violent manner. Feldwebel Erich Paczia was just 24 years old on February 1, 1943. Just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg, Erich Paczia was born on May 7, 1918. He grew up in a Germany changed by National Socialism. He trained in glider clubs that secretly prepared pilots for the Luftwaffe, which was not supposed to exist under the Treaty of Versailles. By early 1943, Paczia had established himself as an exceptional fighter pilot. His 16 confirmed victories placed him among the skilled but not legendary aces of the Luftwaffe. These men performed their jobs with expertise but did not receive fame in propaganda broadcasts. He served with Jagdgeschwader 53 Pikas, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, credited with destroying over 4,000 Allied aircraft during the war. The Bf 109 G4 he piloted that day represented the latest advancement in Willy Messerschmitt's revolutionary fighter design. It was powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine that produced 1,475 horsepower. It was armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, along with two 13mm machine guns in the nose. This made it a formidable adversary for any Allied aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Paczia, it should have been more than capable of besting a lumbering B-17. Yet the reality of aerial combat is harsh. One moment of distraction or one bullet in the wrong spot can make experience irrelevant. Joe James's burst from his twin .50 caliber machine guns found its target. In an instant, Erich Paczia's war came to an end. His body was recovered from the wreckage of his fighter and laid to rest at Bourg Sedria German War Cemetery in Benarous, Tunisia, where it remains today, in Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Paczia was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet recognizing his achievements as a fighter pilot. The citation did not mention the collision. It only noted that he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the traditional letter from his commanding officer, expressing sorrow and commending his service to the Reich. They would never learn that their son's death had resulted in one of the most remarkable survival tales in aviation history. The survival of All-American 3 became a case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts. How did an aircraft missing critical structural components manage to fly for 90 minutes? The answer lay in the innovative design philosophy that had produced the B-17. Unlike previous bombers, which depended on force, the B-17 featured a single main spar that extended through both the wing and the fuselage, using a semi-monocoque design. Its strength did not rely on one part alone, but on the collaboration of the entire structure. The aluminum skin carried loads, reinforced by frames and stringers that spread stress evenly across the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary rotes could sometimes carry enough weight to keep the structure intact. The key to the survival of All-American 3 was that certain parts remained undamaged. The junction where the wing meets the fuselage, the strongest point on the aircraft, stayed intact. The main wing spars, which supported the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks, remained unharmed. The bomb bay, built to handle 8,000 pounds of ordnance, created a sturdy box that held the front and back sections together, even when other connections were compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, in reviewing the incident reports, noted that the B-17 was designed with potential combat damage in mind from the start. He stated in a technical memo that they knew these planes would take hits and built in redundancy wherever possible. This included multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, and structural components capable of carrying loads even if their neighboring parts failed. The survival of this aircraft after such serious damage confirmed the value of every additional pound of structure included in its design. The electrical system was vital to the aircraft's survival. Although some mechanical control cables were damaged or severed, the electrical wires connected to the autopilot servos remained partially operational. This allowed pilots Bragg and Engel to retain some control through the Norden bomb site's autopilot system. While this capability was not initially intended for this purpose, it became crucial in extreme circumstances. The survival of All-American 3 created waves within both the Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, it turned into a morale-boosting story shared in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If All-American 3 could return home with half of its tail shot off, surely their own damaged planes could too. The psychological impact was significant. Crews flew with more confidence, knowing their flying fortresses could withstand damage that would cripple other aircraft. The 414th Bombardment Squadron even adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident, featuring a puppy praying at the top of an aircraft's tail. The phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer," symbolizes a significant moment. Although the well-known song refers to the Thunderbird aircraft, it became closely linked with All-American 3 in squadron lore. For the Germans, this event heightened worries about American manufacturing strength. Field Marshal Gerhard Milch, who oversaw Luftwaffe aircraft production, had already cautioned about the strategic effects of American bomber manufacturing. He remarked, "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars. No, they build them faster than we can." He emphasized that these bombers were not delicate. They were more like flying tanks. This had profound tactical consequences. Luftwaffe doctrine assumed that severe structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for essential areas, wing roots, cockpits, and bomb bays. A few well-placed cannon shells were expected to ensure destruction. However, incidents involving All-American 3 showed that even perfect shots might not take down a B-17. Major Garral, who would later become the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, expressed his frustration in attacking B-17s. He noted how you could hit them, see parts flying off, yet the bomber would keep flying. You could exhaust all your ammunition, and it still would not go down. At times, he even wondered if American bombers had some sort of supernatural protection. In response, the Germans began creating new tactics. They attacked from the front, where defensive armament was weaker. They focused multiple fighters on single bombers and developed heavier weapons meant for bomber destruction. The 30mm Mk108 cannon fired explosive shells capable of creating meter-wide holes in bomber structures, representing a direct answer to the B-17's resilience. The 10 men who survived the extraordinary flight of All-American 3 would carry this experience for the rest of their lives, each in their unique way. Their tale, supported by documents and eyewitness accounts, remains one of the most well-documented events in World War II aviation history. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. would complete his tour of duty and return to the United States. There, he became an instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews skills that might save their lives. He seldom discussed February 1st, 1943, even with his family. When he did, he would simply say, "We were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky." He passed away on October 13, 1999, at the age of 81. He took with him the full experience of flying an aircraft that shouldn't have flown. Navigator Harry C. Newsell wrote a letter home just days after the incident. His letter offers our most recent account of what happened. The letter, which includes the signatures of all 10 crew members, captures the immediate reactions before time could change the details. "I still can't believe we made it," he wrote. "When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were done for. But Bragg and Engel kept her in the air. I don't know how, but they did." Nessel would die on June 27, 1991, at the age of 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the unofficial historian for the crew. He spent decades correcting the myths that surrounded their story. In interviews conducted near his life's end, he debunked many embellishments. No, they did not use parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they did not finish their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way back. No, they weren't headed to England. They were returning to their base in Algeria. Burbridge realized that the true story was amazing enough without exaggeration. He died on February 3, 2013, at the age of 92, one of the last witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut after the war. He rarely spoke of his military service. Those who knew him said that he sometimes moved his hands as if he were controlling an aircraft. This happened especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3, 2007, dying at age 92 with his family by his side. Technical Sergeant Jacques, whose guns killed Erich Paczia and caused the collision, struggled with the complexities of his role in that event. He saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter. However, that action led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him. "I did my job," he would say when asked. "That is all any of us did, our job." The waist gunners Michael Zuck and Elton Condor said that watching Sam Serlis crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they saw in the war. "We saw many brave men do brave things," Zuck said in a 1985 interview. "But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special." Lonesome Sam, who had clung to the severed tail section, became a bit of a legend in the Army Air Forces. His straightforward bravery, shown by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, embodied the unshakable resolve of the best American air crews. When asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage, he simply said, "What else was I going to do?" Sitting there and waiting to fall from the sky was not an option. It was better to die trying than to die waiting. Radio operator Paul Galloway remarked that keeping communication with the base during their return flight was one of the toughest things he had ever faced. "Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart, but I kept transmitting our position and maintained a steady voice," he recalled. "If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us." A photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from Flying Flit Gun became one of the most analyzed images of World War II. Catalogued as United States Air Force Photo 050524 F1234 P015. It shows all American planes in profile against the North African desert, with the damage to her tail clearly visible. Engineers, pilots, and historians would study this image for decades, searching for insights into the impossible. The photograph reveals both severe damage and unlikely survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is entirely missing. The vertical stabilizer bears a massive diagonal gash. The fuselage is open from the tail gunner's position moving forward. Yet, the aircraft is in level flight, with all 4 engines still running. There are no signs of the structural failure that physics would predict. Over the years, the photograph has often been misattributed and misidentified. Some have claimed it shows the aircraft over the English Channel, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Others have published it with captions saying it was taken from a German fighter. Some versions even have been altered to make the damage look more dramatic than it was. But the original authenticated photograph needs no enhancements. It captures a moment that defies explanation. An aircraft remains in flight despite damage beyond all design tolerances, safety margins, and reasonable expectations. It serves as visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would describe as divine intervention. The incident of February 1, 1943, took place at a critical point in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once thought to be unbeatable under Erwin Rommel, was now facing pressure from Montgomery's 8th Army in the east and American forces advancing from the west. The port facilities in Tunis and Bizerte were crucial lifelines for the Axis forces. Each successful bombing mission moved the German surrender in North Africa closer. Just 3 months after the miraculous return of All-American III, the Axis forces would surrender. On May 13, 1943, around 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. This defeat was as significant as Stalingrad for German military strength. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American III, contributed to this victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would become the most recognized American bomber of World War II. While the B-24 Liberator was produced in larger numbers and could carry more bombs further, it was the B-17 that captured public attention. Its ability to withstand damage and bring crews home became legendary. By the end of the war, B-17s had dropped 640,036 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. However, the toll was immense. Out of 12,731 B-17s produced, 4,735 were lost in combat, with each loss representing 10 young men who would not return home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completing a 25-mission tour, later increased to 35, was seen as beating the odds. The survival of All-American III highlighted the grim realities of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers studying this incident gained important insights into how the aircraft survived. Analyses indicate that the aircraft operated at the very edge of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted significantly backwards due to structural loss, putting the aircraft in a state that would challenge even modern flight control systems. Key factors in its survival included structural redundancy. The B-17's design featured multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems, which were not meant to handle full loads, managed to maintain enough integrity. Speed reduction also played a critical role. By immediately slowing down, Bragg reduced the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Reducing speed significantly lessened the stress on the damaged structure. Analysis of gentle control inputs reveals that any sudden movements would have exceeded the limits of the remaining structure. Bragg and Ingalls' careful, coordinated control kept the forces within survivable levels. When the crew moved forward from the tail section, they helped shift the center of gravity forward. This partially compensated for the lost tail weight. The relatively smooth air over the North African desert meant there was no severe turbulence that could stress the damaged aircraft. If they had encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the aircraft likely would not have survived. The engineering community still studies this incident. It serves as an example of how strong design combined with skilled flying can achieve what seems impossible. The lessons learned influence post-war aircraft design, especially regarding structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance. Research into Luftwaffe archives has provided the German viewpoint on the incident. The loss of Erich Paczia was documented in the war diary of JG-53 with typical precision. Paczia did not return from his combat mission against the American bomber formation. Oberleutnant Meimberg observed him colliding with an enemy aircraft. The aircraft and pilot were lost. What the official records fail to capture is the effect such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with fewer than 100 flight hours by 1943, were told that American bombers were easy targets. They were supposedly slow and vulnerable. Then, during attacks, these young pilots saw the bombers endure significant damage and continue flying. Oberstleutnant Egon Mir, who developed the head-on attack tactic that became standard Luftwaffe doctrine against bomber formations, stated, "The American bombers were not what we expected. We thought they would be like our own bombers, fragile and needing fighter escort. Instead, we found flying fortresses in the truest sense. These were castles in the air that could defend themselves and survive damage that seemed impossible." The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records of B-17 survivability. They aimed to identify weak points and optimal attack angles. Their studies revealed that even when they inflicted what should have been catastrophic damage, B-17s often had an unsettling ability to return home. This resulted in the creation of heavier armaments for fighter planes. This included rockets and 30mm cannons specifically made for destroying bombers. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, the news of the survival of All-American 3 brought quiet satisfaction. The engineers and workers who built aircraft 41-24406 had never met the men who flew it, yet they felt a bond. Every rivet installed, every wire connected, and every system tested played a role in bringing those 10 men home. The B-17 design started in 1934 when the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which became the B-17, first took to the skies on July 28, 1935. From the outset, the design prioritized survivability. It featured multiple engines to allow flight even with one or two failures, redundant control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating around vital components and crew areas. However, the situation with All-American 3 surpassed Boeing's expectations. The company used this incident in training materials for new engineers, highlighting the significance of redundancy and robust design. The motto, "Build it stronger than it needs to be," emerged because someone's life may depend on that extra strength one day. The production figures for the B-7 program remain impressive even today. At its height, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were producing 16 B-17 aircraft daily. The workforce included thousands of women, known as Rosie the Riveters, many of whom had never worked in manufacturing prior to the war. They reached quality standards that would be hard to match even with modern computer-controlled equipment. Over the years, the story of All-American 3 has developed layers of myth and exaggeration. Different versions have added dramatic details that did not happen. Some claimed the crew used parachute cords to keep the plane intact, finished their bombing run after the collision, flew all the way to England, or that the tail gunner was rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while captivating, actually lessen the remarkable achievement. The reality, confirmed by contemporary documents, crew accounts, and photographic evidence, stands strong on its own. 10 men navigated a severely damaged aircraft for 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They accomplished this through skill, determination, and teamwork. Remarkably, they did it without losing a single crew member. They flew an aircraft that seemed unfit for the sky, yet it managed to stay airborne. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who later worked to set the record straight, recognized this. He believed the true story was astonishing enough on its own. "We don't need to embellish," he stated in his last interview. "What unfolded that day seemed impossible, but we accomplished it regardless. That is the narrative worth sharing." The 414th Bombardment Squadron completed 178 combat missions during World War II, suffering the loss of 85 aircraft and numerous aircrew. However, no tale from their record matched the sheer improbability of the All-American 3 incident. This event became a defining part of the squadron's identity, a pivotal story reflecting their incredible capabilities. Their new emblem, inspired by the event, depicted a puppy kneeling before a tail section. Choosing a puppy over a more traditional symbol illustrated the youth of the aircrew. Most were in their early 20s, highlighting their vulnerability against enemy fighters and flak. Yet, the praying pose symbolized both hope and the divine intervention. Many crew members believed spared All-American 3. Decades after the war, veterans from the 414th would meet for reunions. During these gatherings, someone would always recount the tale from February 1, 1943. Men who had faced their own terrifying missions and endured against the odds listened respectfully to the story of the bomber that would not be defeated. The encounter between German fighter forces and All-American 3 marked a significant learning moment that triggered tactical and technical advancements through 1943. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with fighters designed for dogfighting, nimble aircraft armed with rifle-caliber machine guns suitable for taking down other fighters. The emergence of heavy bombers forced a total reassessment. By mid-1943, driven by incidents like All-American 3, German fighters began to be equipped with heavier armaments. The Bf 109G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia event, featured a 30mm Mk108 cannon firing explosive shells that could create wide breaches in bomber structures. The FW-190 was adapted to carry multiple 20mm cannons and even two 10mm rockets aimed specifically at bomber destruction. Major Walter Nowotny, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished bomber interceptors with 258 victories, documented this transformation. Each month, American bombers seemed to become tougher. We developed new tactics and weapons. In response, they improved their defensive formations, armor, and long-range escort fighters. It felt like a race we were slowly losing. The psychological effect on German pilots was profound. Young pilots, increasingly less trained as the war continued, were ordered to attack bomber formations. However, attacking B-17s meant flying into streams of .50 caliber fire from many planes. The survival rate for German fighter pilots sharply decreased as 1943 went on. The survival of all American aircraft was due not only to Boeing's design, but also to an entire industrial ecosystem supporting the planes. The Wright R-20 Cyclone engines were made in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The .50 caliber machine guns were produced in facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. Instruments were made at numerous specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network ensured no single bombing raid or sabotage operation could greatly affect B-17 production. It also allowed for rapid improvements and modifications across the network. Lessons from combat damage were integrated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization is hard to fathom. In 1939, the United States Army Air Force had just 1,700 aircraft in total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The B-17 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, working 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond its technical achievements and strategic significance, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing daunting conditions. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who responded to their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete. NES was an engineering student. Burbridge joined before Pearl Harbor because he simply wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism amidst catastrophic damage reflects the quality of American aircrew training. The Army Air Forces created from scratch the largest aerial training program in history. By 1943, training bases throughout America were producing 100,000 new pilots each year. This training included a similar number of navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and other aircrew. It focused on technical skills and the importance of crew coordination and emergency procedures. Crews trained together, learning one another's strengths and weaknesses. They developed teamwork that would prove vital in combat situations. The crew of All-American 3 had been flying together for months. They built a level of mutual trust that enabled them to operate effectively, even with their aircraft falling apart around them. While the survival of one bomber might seem insignificant in a conflict with thousands of aircraft involved, the strategic implications were substantial. This incident took place during a pivotal time when American daylight bombing doctrine was under serious scrutiny. The idea that heavily armed bombers could reach targets without fighter escorts was proving to be costly. Yet incidents like that of All-American 3 showed that the B-17 could survive the journey home, even when it had sustained severe damage. This ability to survive meant that experienced crews were more likely to complete their missions. Doing so preserved valuable knowledge and improved overall effectiveness. It also meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired and put back into service, rather than being classified as total losses. More importantly, it influenced German strategic planning. If American bombers were so hard to destroy, and if American factories could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, the dynamics of aerial attrition shifted in favor of the Allies. This realization prompted a gradual change in German production from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters, a shift that ultimately proved to be in vain. Despite the wealth of documentation, some elements of All-American III's survival continue to be the focus of engineering research. How did the few remaining structural members, meant to endure only about 20% of the loads they faced, hold together for 90 minutes? Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the dangerous vibration that can disintegrate damaged aircraft, occur during the return flight? The aircraft seemed to operate in a nonlinear regime, a state where typical aerodynamic principles become erratic. The fact that the aircraft remained controllable in this condition might have stemmed from a fortunate combination of factors, including the specific damage pattern. The weather conditions and the pilot's expertise came together to create a remarkable survival story against daunting challenges. In 1985, several surviving crew members met for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Time had grayed their hair and slowed their movements, but standing next to a B-17, they felt young again. They explored the aircraft, each recalling their roles from that fateful day 42 years earlier. Bragg, at 67, took his place in the pilot's seat once more. His hands instinctively grasped the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he remarked softly. "She brought us home when she could have given up. You cannot ask for more from a plane." Burbridge stood in the bombardier's position, pointing through the plexiglass. "That is where I saw the fighter approaching us. I can still picture his face before James took him out." They signed autographs for aviation fans eager to meet the men of All-American III. They answered questions, posed for photos, and reminisced. Yet there were moments of deep silence. In those intervals, each man found himself back over Tunisia, feeling the aircraft shake from impacts, wondering if death was just a heartbeat away. Military historians view the All-American III incident within the larger air war over Europe and North Africa. This event highlights the strength of American bomber design and the bravery of the young men flying them. It shows that survival in aerial combat often relied on a mix of solid engineering, expert piloting, and sheer luck. The event also shaped future aviation design. The idea of redundancy, creating aircraft that could withstand battle damage, became vital in military aircraft development. Today's combat planes include lessons learned from B-17 experiences, such as multiple hydraulic systems, backup flight controls, and designs that minimize the risk of catastrophic failure from localized damage. The survival statistics from All-American III are striking. There were 90 minutes of flight from collision to landing, 150 miles traveled despite severe damage, and an altitude of 20,000 feet at impact. 10 crew members survived without injuries. The tail section remained attached by just a thread. It took 6 weeks to repair and return to service. One photograph captured the extraordinary feat for posterity. 16 victories. Erich Paczia's combat record prior to the collision features the serial number 41-24406. This number should have appeared on a loss report. These details tell a tale of survival that seems impossible, yet it has been meticulously documented and verified. Today, only a handful of B-17 aircraft remain in flying condition. They are preserved by dedicated organizations that honor the legacy of the Flying Fortress. When these planes are showcased at air shows, veterans and aviation fans come together. They want to hear the unique sound of the Wright Cyclone engines and relive memories. The narrative of All-American III is often recounted by someone who has connections to the event or has studied it in detail. Young attendees often listen with doubt. They wonder if the story has been embellished. However, when they see the photographs, read the crew's accounts, and look at the technical reports, their doubt transforms into awe. The aircraft itself is no longer around. It was scrapped in 1945 after giving everything it had. Yet its story lives on in museums, in literature, and in the memories of a decreasing number of World War II veterans. It has evolved into more than just a plane. It symbolizes American industrial strength, the bravery of air crews, and the inexplicable nature of survival during wartime. In his final interview before he passed away in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to convey about All-American 3. After a long pause, he said, "We were just doing our job." This is what people today need to grasp. They were not heroes. They were young men miles away from home, fulfilling a necessary task. The airplane was crafted by individuals focused on their work, creating the best bomber possible. When danger struck, each person played their role. Kenny piloted the plane. The gunners kept watch for enemy fighters. Burbridge assisted with navigation. Sam crawled out of the tail section. The true miracle wasn't merely surviving. The miracle stemmed from the thousands of people involved, factory workers who built the plane and ground crews who repaired it. All of them did their jobs well enough to create a chance for survival when everything went wrong. That embodies the American spirit. Everyone fulfills their role. And sometimes in your time of greatest need, everything aligns perfectly. They flew home in an aircraft that was barely operational, landed a plane that shouldn't have landed, and walked away from what should have been their demise. If that isn't a miracle, then what is? The narrative of All-American 3 goes beyond just an aircraft. This story goes beyond a simple account of combat. It marks a moment when the impossible became possible. Here, engineering skill met human determination, creating results that still defy our expectations of aircraft endurance. The 10 men who returned home on February 1, 1943, were not just powered by 4 Wright Cyclone engines and Boeing aluminum. They were supported by the collective expertise of American industry, the training of the Army Air Forces, and perhaps something beyond that. Call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival demonstrated that the B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through proven capability, not just propaganda. For the Germans who witnessed it, this event revealed the true nature of their opposition. They were not just fighting American aircraft, but also facing American industrial strength, training systems, and resolve. For a Luftwaffe already grappling with the challenges of attrition, this incident proved that the odds would never be in their favor. The photograph from that day, showing a B-17 with its tail nearly severed, has become one of World War II's most iconic images. It signifies more than just a miraculous survival. It embodies the spirit of the American air campaign, damaged yet still airborne, injured yet still battling against overwhelming odds, still headed home. Kendrick Bragg and his crew did not aim to make history on February 1, 1943. They intended to bomb their target and return to base, just another mission in a seemingly endless war. But when disaster struck and a dying German fighter nearly split their aircraft in half, they responded with the quiet professionalism characteristic of the greatest generation. They did not panic or surrender. They simply executed what needed to be done. Each man at his station, each fulfilling his role, trusting in their aircraft, their training, and one another. In doing so, they created a narrative that would outlast them all, a testament to what is possible when engineering excellence meets human bravery. The Germans were astonished when they saw 2 aircraft merge into one. Fighter and bomber entwined in a violent clash that should have destroyed them both. They were even more taken aback when the American bomber, defying all laws of physics and chance, made it home. It was a preview of American industrial and military capacity that would ultimately overpower the Third Reich. 3 aircraft returned home on February 1, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't. They flew in a plane that technically could not fly, yet it did. This aircraft carried more than just its crew. It carried evidence that American bombers were stronger than anyone had thought. It demonstrated that American air crews could face any challenge. It showed that sometimes, in the darkest moments of war, the impossible can become possible. The tail section, which eventually fell off after landing, had been unable to support the weight of 3 curious ground crew members. Yet in flight, it managed to hold itself together for 90 minutes. This remains one of aviation's great mysteries. It reminds us that human courage and determination can sometimes defy the laws of physics. Today, when engineers review the incident, when historians document it, and when veterans recollect it, they reach an undeniable conclusion. This should not have been possible. The evidence is clear. The photographs, testimonies, and official records confirm that all three American aircraft made it home when they should have crashed. Within this improbability lies the true essence of the story. It reminds us that at times of extreme human experience, when life and death are on the line, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. 10 young Americans in a broken airplane over hostile land refused to accept defeat. In their resolve, they created a legend that will last as long as people remember the Second World War. The Germans were astonished when two B-17s flew piggyback. One was dying, the other was damaged, but both were determined to survive. They witnessed American engineering at its best, American airmanship in its prime, and American determination at its strongest. They saw the impossible happen.